So welcome to NOAA Live. My name is Grace Simpkins, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is sponsored by NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network, which is spread across the country and helps connect people to all that NOAA does, and Woods Hole Sea Grant, where I work, just located at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. To find out about future webinars, you can look under the Woods Hole Sea Grant Education tab on our webpage, or simply follow us on Facebook. This is the third webinar in a series designed to help you get to know NOAA and some of our incredible experts during these weeks of school closures. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA, which stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So every time we say NOAA, we're using that acronym for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Today, we're introducing you to Cara Wilson. She has a phenomenal talk about being a satellite oceanographer and how she studies ocean from space. A few guidelines before I turn it over to her. You are all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear the speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions. We encourage you to ask them. And as we go along, I'll be keeping track for Cara. She will stop every now and then, and I'll ask her some of your questions and she'll answer some of them. We may not get to all of your questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Depending on your device, how you access the question box may be different. For some of you, it may be a question mark on the bottom or side of the screen. Others might have a little box on the side of the screen with an arrow and a hand. Click the arrow to show the question box. We will not be using the raise hand function. But based on what I'm seeing here, I think everyone has figured it out. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Cara and her amazing talk.
Great, thanks, Grace. Well, as Grace said, my name is Cara Wilson, and I am a satellite oceanographer based in Monterey, California, which is a long way away from Massachusetts, where I know a lot of you are calling in from. I was actually born in Massachusetts. I was born in Boston, and as a kid, we spent summers out in Cape Cod, which is where I first got interested and fascinated by the ocean. I don't remember a whole lot about Cape Cod though, because I was really small, but the one thing I do remember is that my sister and I were always really amused when we drove through the town of Sandwich, because we thought that was just such a funny name for a town. So as I said, I'm a satellite oceanographer, but what exactly does that mean? What that means is that I study the oceans using data that we collect from satellites. But what is a satellite? Does anybody know what a satellite is? I have a picture of one here. We can see here a satellite flying above the Earth, collecting data from the ocean. Basically, what a satellite is a satellite is any object that circles around another object. So has anyone actually seen a real satellite? Actually, I'm pretty sure that we all have. We've all seen the moon, right? Well, the moon is actually a naturally occurring satellite. The moon circles around the Earth, circles around the planet, and so it is a satellite. So we've all seen the moon, we've all actually seen a satellite. But most of the time when we use the word satellite, we're referring to man-made objects that we have put into space to orbit around the planet to collect information for us. And that's kind of what we're seeing depicted here. This ribbon of color that's streaming behind the satellite is representing data from the surface of the ocean that's being collected by the satellite, so that we can get this information and find out information about the oceans, and also land. We collect data over land as well from satellites. So what can we measure from satellites? There's a number of things that we can measure from satellites. We can measure the amount of sea ice that we see that occur in the North Pole and the South Pole. We can measure the magnitude and direction of winds over the oceans. We can measure the temperature of the surface of the ocean. We can measure salinity. What salinity is how salty the water is. If you've been in the ocean, you know the water is different than water in a pool or that comes out of your tap water, and that it's really salty. And we call them how salty the water is salinity. That's what the term salinity means. And then we can also measure the color of the ocean. Now you might be thinking, well, these scientists are really pretty stupid because we all know that the ocean is blue. So why do we need a satellite to measure the color of the ocean when we know it's blue? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. As we can see in this color wheel here, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. There's 3 shades of blue that are shown in this color wheel here. So which shade of blue is the ocean? Is the ocean always the same color? Is it always the same shade of blue? Well, it's not. What we can see here, as we can see here in a number of these images, there's a a lot of different shades of blue that we can see in the ocean, but there's also other shades of color. Whoops, sorry about that. There are shades of red, there are shades of green, there are shades of brown. This isn't an ocean, this is actually a river, but you get the point. There's actually a lot of different variations in the color of the oceans. Now, does anybody have any idea what might be causing these different colors that we see in the ocean? And if you have any ideas, you can type them in. We getting any responses, Grace?
So I'm looking at the responses. I'm not seeing folks go ahead and put in your question. Oh, so I have some folks say they think that the color is from the sun. Some think it's chemicals or perhaps temperature, pollution, the sunlight reflecting off, the bacteria, algae. Look, a couple people are saying algae and plankton. Actually, that's got a lot of votes.
A lot of votes. Okay, well, let's talk about algae and plankton then. Yeah, so algae and plankton are basically plants that are floating in the ocean. And if we think about plants on land, how can we tell a plant on land when we see plants on land? Is there anything they all kind of have in common? Any thoughts about that?
So I think there's just a tiny bit. Oh, so some folks say that we can look for leaves. We can tell because they're green.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, most plants, almost all plants are green. And the reason they're green is that they contain a pigment called chlorophyll. Now, the other thing about plants, what makes a plant, what distinguishes a plant from, say, an animal? How is a plant different than an animal, you or me, or a whale, or your pet dog? What makes a plant, and what do plants do differently than animals do?
So I have Diane telling me that they use the sun for energy. Catherine says they make their own food and they have leaves. Gretchen says that animals can move. Gabriel says that plants don't have brains.
Very good. Those awesome responses. So yes, basically the difference between plants and animals are that plants get their energy from the sunlight. So they don't have to eat the way animals do. And they use chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the pigment in them that enables them to harvest energy from the sunlight for their energy. So that's why plants are green. So we see plants on the ocean, on land, rather. Let me go back to the PowerPoint here. So on land, we see this. So are there any plants in this photo? Yes, we can see that there's trees, and we can see that the trees, because they are in the shape of trees, but they're also this color green. If we look at this image, our eyes automatically sort of see there's these areas of green, there's the areas of brown, the desert, and we know that there's plants and there's plant life in these areas where it's green. And this is basically what the satellites are doing as well. Basically picking out areas where there's more green, and that's going to be more chlorophyll or more plant life. So as I said, there are plants in the ocean. They're not floating trees or shrubs. What the plants in the oceans are called phytoplankton. And what that means is it means floating plants. Phyto means plant, and plankton is a floating object. Now these phytoplankton are really small. They can only be seen with a microscope. So the phytoplankton that we're seeing in this image here are what we might see if we got a sample of water, took it back to the lab, and put it under a microscope. So these are all really pretty small. So it's a big difference between plants on land and plants in the ocean. So now why do we care about phytoplankton? The reason we care about phytoplankton is at the base of the food chain. And what I mean by that is we can see here in this image, here's our phytoplankton on the left, and they're getting their energy from the sunlight. And then they're eaten by little things called zooplankton. If you listen to the webinar on Wednesday, Allison talked about zooplankton. And if you missed the webinar on Wednesday, just as a reminder, all of these are being recorded and are available on the Woods Hole Sea Grant webpage. But so zooplankton eat phytoplankton, and then smaller fish eat zooplankton, and larger fish eat the small fish. So basically, everything living in the ocean relies upon phytoplankton, even if it doesn't directly eat the phytoplankton. So that's why phytoplankton is so important, and why we really want to know what phytoplankton is doing in the ocean. Are there any questions about any of that?
So I have a list of questions. We'll go through a couple of them because I think that they are very relevant to what you've just talked about. So one person asked, how much water can you see at once with your satellite?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it really depends on the different type of satellite. And actually, that reminds me, because I actually forgot to, one of the things I was going to show you, and I'll do that right now. That's an excellent question. There are two different types of orbits of satellites. And so here I have a globe representing the Earth. And since I'm a true satellite geek, I actually have satellite earrings. I have earrings in the shape of a satellite. So I'm going to use this to demonstrate the different types of satellite orbits. So a lot of our satellites are what we call polar orbiting. And so this is our satellite, and they orbit, as the name implies, around the pole of the Earth. So they orbit around the Earth like this. And as they do that, the Earth is spinning. So as the Earth spins, the Earth spins, and the satellite orbits around it. And so every time, every circle around the Earth, since the Earth is spinning, it's going to get information from a different part of the planet. So in the course of a day or two, it will get data from every part of the planet. So polar orbits just look at a smaller swath of the ocean. Then we also have geostationary satellites, and they sit a lot further out, and they're always staring at one part of the Earth. So they can see a lot more of the ocean at one time. And they don't orbit around the planet. What they do is they orbit with the planet. So as the Earth spins, the geostationary satellites spin with it, and they're always looking at the same part of the ocean. So we get most of our weather data if you've seen storms that they track across the ocean, we get most of our weather data from geostationary satellites. So it really depends on what type of satellite it is, how big an area you can see. So thank you for that question, because I forgot to do my cute little demonstration there. Any other questions?
We had a couple of questions about phytoplankton, so I'm going to lump some together and let you talk, answer all the questions. So one question is algae a plant or a protist? And then another person asked, what size are they? How big are phytoplankton, and how powerful a microscope would you need to use to see them?
Okay, so the first question was, is phytoplankton a plant? Yes, phytoplankton are plants. And there's a wide range in the size of phytoplankton. They range, so some of them are really very, very small. Some of them are, but basically all of them, pretty much all of them, you need a microscope to see. I'm not really a specialist in the different types of phytoplankton, and to be honest, I very rarely looked at them under a microscope, so I'm not up on my microscope sizes. So I don't actually know the answer to that. So, but there is a very large range of size, but they're all really quite small. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we have a question here from Spiros. Besides atmospheric conditions, what other parameters should you take into consideration when you're trying to measure phytoplankton from space?
Oh, that's a very good question. So atmospheric conditions, the biggest atmospheric condition is clouds. When we make these measurements, the satellites can't see through clouds. And so if it's a cloudy day, you're not going to get any images. There's also a lot of, there are a lot of things that happen to the signals when they go through the atmosphere. So there's a lot of corrections that scientists have to make to basically back out the effect of the signal going through the atmosphere. There's actually a number of things that scientists have to do to this data to get it to a useful state. And a lot of that is kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but there are a lot of things that go into the calibration and the validation of the satellite data. Any other questions?
I'll let you continue on and keep tracking the questions and ask you a few more in a little bit.
Great, okay. Well, at this point, I've done a lot of talking and I actually haven't shown any satellite data. So let's actually look at some satellite data. Now that we understand about chlorophyll and phytoplankton, let's see how this looks like from space. So in this animation here, this is an animation of chlorophyll, both on the land and in the oceans that we've gotten from satellite data. And now what I should mention here is that the colors we're seeing here are not the colors that the satellite is seeing. Rather, in the oceans, the colors have been scaled from, we can see down here at the bottom, purples are very low chlorophyll, and then on the other end of the spectrum, reds, yellows, and reds are a higher chlorophyll. So you can see in the middle of the oceans, we have very little chlorophyll, and there's generally more chlorophyll around in the coastal areas. Similarly, on land, a brown color or basically represents the deserts where there's very little plant life, and then the green areas are where they're forested, and then white is showing you where there's snow. And so what we're seeing here is because the satellites are always measuring and always collecting data, we're looking at about 7 years of data here, and every time the colors change, that represents 1 month. So we're seeing condensed into a very short amount of time. The seasonal cyclone also changes over time. So you can see it's a lot easier for us to understand the seasonal cycle on the land. You can see here, if you look at the snow in the summertime, snow's further up, and then in the wintertime, the snow comes down, covers a lot of North America. In the summer, it disappears. And so you can see this is basically, the course of a year, the snow coming up and down. Similarly, in the oceans, we see seasonal patterns. This is what we call a front of chlorophyll. This is where chlorophyll is higher. And this front moves seasonally. It moves south and north in the Pacific. So satellite data is really valuable because we can see all of these changes. And this is data that would be impossible for us to collect by shipboats because we're getting all of this data continuously over the course of the planet. And it's really cool. I love looking at this image, just the various variations that you can see in phytoplankton, both on the land and on the oceans is really, really, really very cool, I think. Are there any questions about what we're seeing here?
So we have a couple of questions just about satellites in general. Okay. Would you like to answer those now, or would you?
Sure.
So the question was, how big are the satellites you're talking about?
The satellites, there's also, there's a range of size of satellites as well, but these are quite large. I think they're about the size of a school bus generally, so they're pretty big.
Great. And Juan is asking, do satellites ever go off course?
So once they're up there, we are able to manipulate them. And so we can kind of keep them on track, or sometimes we want to change the orbit for some reason. So we can control them once they go up there. And then satellites only last, they have a limited lifetime. Most of them are designed to last for 5 years. We keep them up there as long as they're collecting good data. After, when they're no longer collecting good data, sometimes they're left up there. Sometimes we actually bring them back into orbit, and we usually have them crash into the ocean somewhere.
Great. That answers James's question of how do we get satellites back to Earth if we need to. And one last question, and then I'll let you go on. Sarah asks, do we share these satellites globally?
That's an excellent question. So all of the data that I'm talking about here is freely available data. This is environmental data that scientists use. So this isn't spy information. So all of this data is freely available to scientists, and there are, it's not just the United States that has satellites. There are other countries that have satellite data, and we do all share that data. And particularly remember when I was talking about the geostationary satellites that only look at one side of the planet, in order to get global coverage with geostationary satellites, we need to have more than one. And in fact, in the United States, we always have 2 geostationary satellites because the United States is so big that we need one to look at the east side of the United States and one to look at the west side. So the other countries also have geostationary satellites that look at their own areas. Great question.
Great. I'll let you go on and keep track of the questions as they come.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Grace. So let's move on then. And as I mentioned, so we've talked now about ocean color. I want to talk a little bit about salinity. I mentioned salinity before, and salinity is a really important parameter in the ocean. As I mentioned, it's what makes the oceans different than water we have on land, water in our lakes or ponds. And the salt that's in the water makes it denser. When there's salt in the water, it makes the water more dense, and it's these variations in salinity and in density that are really important for driving the ocean circulation. So I'm going to show you, back to my, okay. So I'm going to do another little demonstration here to show you some differences in salinity. So I have 2 glasses of water here. This is just regular water, just right from the tap. And this is water that I've added salt to. I've just taken some salt from my salt shaker and added it to here. So this water is denser than the regular water. So what happens if I put an egg in each of these? This is 2 regular eggs. I put it in the fresh water, and the egg sinks. And what's going to happen if I put it in the salt water? Any guesses? It floats. I'm going to turn these around so you can see that a little better. So this is the fresh water where the egg sinks, and in the salt water, which is denser, so the egg is less dense than the salt water, the egg floats. That's kind of cool, isn't it? You can try this at home if you want. So now, how salty is the ocean? And what I mean by that is that if I wanted to taste the saltiness of the ocean in a glass of water, how much salt would I have to add to fresh water, a glass of water like this, to make it as salty as the water in the ocean? Any thoughts? I'll make this a multiple choice question. Would I have to add half a cup of salt, or a quarter of a cup of salt, or a teaspoon of salt to this glass of fresh water in order to make it as salty as the water in the ocean? Any thoughts?
Okay, I'm gonna tally the votes because we have some differing opinions.
Okay.
The majority, okay, I think there's actually a tie between a half a cup and a quarter cup. There are a lot of folks saying a half a cup. We have Jack, Colleen, James, Juan, Catherine, Laura, Liam, Layla, Josh, Rebecca. They all think a half cup. Phoebe.
All right.
Luke,
well,
yeah.
Guess what? All those people are wrong. It's a teaspoon. You only need about a teaspoon of water to put in 8 ounces of water to make it the equivalent salinity in the ocean. Now, don't feel bad. I actually asked this question of a bunch of my friends and colleagues, and most of them got it wrong, including some oceanographers. I will not name names. But anyways, so even though it is really salty, it's only the equivalent of about a teaspoon of salt in 8 ounces of water. So let's see how salinity varies in the ocean. And in order to do that, we'll have another little animation. So this is an animation of salinity data that we get from satellites. And again, the colors here are not how the satellite sees the oceans directly. The blues are where there's less salinity, so there's less salt. And the yellows and reds are where there's more, where the water is more salty. So one of the things you can easily see here is that the Atlantic Ocean is a lot saltier than the Pacific Ocean. These yellows and reds in the Atlantic Ocean versus the blues and greens in the Pacific Ocean. The other thing that you can easily see on this animation is look at all this fresh water coming out of the Amazon River. The Amazon River, as we all know, is one of the biggest rivers on the planet. And you can see this plume of fresh water that comes out of the Amazon. It goes all the way up into the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes it moves east across the Atlantic, going over to Africa. And you can see it's not always there. This is what we call seasonal changes. So there's parts of the year when it's coming out really strongly, like we see now. This is in May and June. You can see the date down here. And then there's other times when it's like now, in November, where there's not much flow coming out of the Amazon. We can see the same thing happening in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico is where the Mississippi, the United States' biggest river, there it goes, a big plume of fresh water just entered into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's in September, that was about in September. This is a seasonal phenomenon. So in the wintertime here, there's not a lot of flow coming down. It's April, here we go. It's May, June, fresh water coming in here. Any questions about anything that we're seeing here?
Give me 1 second, sorry, to grab the questions that you've got coming in. So not necessarily about the salinity, but someone was asking who owns these satellites and maintains them, the ones that you're using to gather this data?
That's a great question. So as was mentioned earlier, there are different countries that have satellites. And in the United States, there's basically two main agencies that have that put up satellites that gather this kind of environmental information. There's NASA, puts up some satellites, but NOAA also puts up satellites. So we have sort of different roles and responsibilities. NASA tends to put up research satellites. So if we're trying to figure out if we can measure something from space, NASA will put the satellites, will develop the satellites, and then once it's information that we want to keep maintaining on a regular basis, then NOAA is responsible for those satellites. So both NASA and NOAA have satellites collecting this kind of information in the United States. Great question.
Great. Liam is also asking, looking at this data you're showing us, why does the Pacific have less salt than the Atlantic?
Well, that's a great question. And the sort of primary reason for this is that you see the mountains here along the United States and also along Chile, not in Chile, in South America. Basically what happens is as water evaporates from the surface of the ocean, and when it moves, so when this water, when the air with a lot of water in it hits the coast here, it basically, it condenses and it turns into rain and it comes back into the Pacific. So basically there's a sort of a closed loop here where a lot of this water that evaporates gets returned back to the Pacific, and that doesn't happen in the Atlantic. Great question.
Okay, I think that's it for now. I'll let you keep going. Thanks.
Great. Sure. So we've talked about salinity and we've talked about ocean color, but there's other things that we can measure from satellites. And so I just want to touch briefly and talk briefly about temperature, ocean winds, and sea ice. And for temperature, one of the applications that we use for sea surface temperature data is to monitor coral reefs. We have here a picture of a live coral reef on the left, and then on the right, we have a dead coral reef. Coral reefs are really sensitive to temperature. And so one of the issues that are facing coral reefs now is that ocean temperatures are increasing. And these increases in water temperature can kill coral reefs, such as the reef that we see here on the right. So scientists are using temperature data that we measure from satellites to monitor the health of coral reefs and also to sort of predict areas where our coral reefs might be in danger. So that's kind of one application of satellite data. What we're looking at here are two images of two different hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, that we're seeing the direction and magnitude of the winds from the satellite data. So here on the left, we have Katrina, which hit the New Orleans area back in 2005. And again, the colors are the reds are really strong wind, and the blues are lower wind speed. And you can see the arrows show the direction of the hurricane. This was Katrina, and then this was Sandy that hit the east coast of the United States back in 2012. And have you all heard the term the eye of the hurricane? Anybody know what the eye of the hurricane means? Any responses to that?
Yeah, I'm looking for responses. I'm not seeing, I'm just waiting for some folks to weigh in. The eye of the hurricane. I know that here on Cape Cod, we talk about hurricanes a lot, and so I've heard that term. Anybody have any ideas? Let's see. I think people want to know.
Want to know? Okay. So the eye of the hurricane is referring to, in the center of the hurricane, there's usually a lull. There's an area where the wind speed isn't as strong. And we can see that in both of these hurricanes here. So you can see it better defined in Sandy. So here, this streak of really high wind speeds here But then in the middle of this, there's this area where you could see the yellows and the blues. The wind speed is a lot lower. So this is what they call the eye of the hurricane. So it's this area in the center of the hurricane where the wind speed is actually a little bit less. You can see this in Katrina as well. It's not quite as big, but right there in the center of the hurricane, the wind speed is a little bit less. So that's called the eye of the hurricane. And again, satellite data is really great because we have this really good coverage of the whole expanse of these storm systems, and so we can really pick out and see features like this. Any questions about this?
I don't have any questions about that. Some folks did think that the eye of the hurricane was where the stronger winds were, but I think you already answered that. So
yeah, it's actually the least strong. Well, not the least, but it's a reduction in the wind strength right in the middle of the hurricane. All right, well, we'll go on to my last slide, and what we're looking at here is sea ice, and we're looking at an animation going all the way back to 1979. You can see here on the upper right the date of the. Did this stop? It looked like it stopped. Is this moving? It's not moving. It's stuck in 1989. Why is that? Okay, there's moving again. So what this is showing the extent of sea ice in the Arctic in an animation going from 1979 up to I think 2018 or something. So this white area that we're looking at is showing the extent of the sea ice in the summertime. So what we can see is that over time it's changing. There's interannual variability, so sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's smaller, but actually over time it's decreasing. It's actually decreased quite remarkably. And that's one of the key things that we get from satellite data as well, is because we have a lot of these satellites have been up for so long. We have these measurements that go back, in this case, 40 years, so we can see how things are changing over time. And that's really important for us to be able to monitor changes that are happening to our planet. So this is if we sort of keep an eye on the sort of boundary of the sea ice. We're in 2011 now. And then watch when it's going to jump back to 1979. Oh, there it goes. You see how it's much bigger? So basically, in the summertime, the summer extent of the sea ice used to be a lot larger than it is now. So that's the last animation or last slide that I wanted to show you all. And so now I'm happy to take questions. We have actually another 15 minutes or so. So I'm happy to take questions about anything that I talked about today or anything else satellite related.
So I have a couple of different questions.
Great.
So since you were just talking about sea ice, we had the question, why does the ice get smaller? And also, why is it changing so slowly?
So the ice gets smaller. I mean, basically that's, there's a seasonal component to that, because so in the summertime when things warm up, the sea ice will melt. And so then in the wintertime, the sea ice builds up again. So this is a seasonal phenomenon. So every winter it'll build up, and in the summertime it'll decrease. But what we're seeing over time is there's a change in that. So now over in the summertime, there's basically less ice than there used to be, say 40 years ago. And the reason why that is happening is because of global warming. As we know that the planet is slowly warming up, and so that this is one of the ways that we see that, in that the summer times are slightly more warmer in the Arctic than they used to be, and so that's why we're seeing less sea ice there than we did 40 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. So Anna asks, do satellites float up or down?
They float up or down. I'm not.
I'm sorry. I think they're asking if the satellites have an up or a down.
Okay. Well, so if we go back to my little satellite earring here, so one thing that they do have, you can see the little wings on my satellite here, and these are solar panels. So a lot of the satellites are fueled just like phytoplankton by the sunlight. So they have these solar panels. So these will be directed so that the solar panels are facing towards the sun. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but yes, there is a certain orientation that they are in to to fly right. Sort of like
Thank you. Liam is also, actually, there are a couple of questions from different folks about whether satellites are looking at freshwater. Do they see lakes? Do they see rivers and ponds?
Yes, they do. I mean, this was a talk about satellite oceanography, so I focused on the oceans. But and actually, if we go back to, let's go back to the animation of phytoplankton. So if we go to this animation, let me start this. You can see here that actually you see the Great Lakes. Here's the Great Lakes. So we can get data from the Great Lakes, which is freshwater. There's also some other lakes that show up on here. The algorithms are slightly different to deal with freshwater, but yes, the satellites can see freshwater as well.
Great. I also want to just make a plug right here for NOAA's Science on a Sphere. I don't know if you have used that at all, Cara, but there is a desktop version that folks at home can download for free. And yeah, so Science on a Sphere, if anyone wants to look at some of the things that Cara is showing you, take a look. You can just Google it and you'll be able to find NOAA's Science on a Sphere, and you can see some of these different things. I also was hoping you might mention the Windy app, because I think that might be, or if you're not familiar with that, there's another app that folks can get on their phones for free at home that will show them from satellite imagery, wind patterns and direction of wind and so on, if you want to see some images similar to what Cara is showing you. But another question for you, Cara, that I would love to hear the answer for as well. How did you get into this job, and what made you want to do this?
Well, it's kind of, I sort of had a roundabout way of how I got into this. I actually, I got my PhD looking at studying hydrothermal vents. So hydrothermal vents are basically occur at the bottom of the ocean. And so I like to say that I used to study the bottom of the ocean, and now I study the top of the ocean. So I'm moving up in the world. But how I got into satellite data was I was actually looking for a job, and I applied for a job that involved using satellite data, and I got the job, and that's and that's how I started looking at satellite data. But what I really like about satellite data is I like the scale of it. As I said, I like how it visualizes the entire planet. And anyways, to me, I think it's just really I think it's really cool, the stuff that we can look at with satellite data. So I sort of stumbled upon it. It's not what I studied in graduate school, but it's I kind of came upon it later in my career, and I've been hooked ever since.
Great. We also have a few questions. There was a lot of interest in the salinity, and looking, if you wouldn't mind going back to that salinity slide, why there's less salt at the North and the South Pole. Why is there so much salt in the Mediterranean Sea? Jack and Joseph were asking some questions about just the patterns they saw on this.
So those are great questions. So a lot of it has to do with precipitation. So basically, if when we have precipitation, precipitation and evaporation. So when water evaporates from the ocean, it leaves the salt behind. So what happens in the Mediterranean is it's a warm area, so water will evaporate, leaving the salty water behind. So that's why the Mediterranean is in general so salty. And then what happens in the polar areas is that when water freezes, it excludes the salinity. So you could try this at home. You can make some salt water and freeze it. And what will happen is when the water freezes into that ice crystals, it excludes the salt, so that the ice will not be salty. It'll be fresh water. So what happens in the polar areas when ice is formed, you get, well, sort of a little backwards there. You do get saltier water, but then that saltier water is dense and it sinks out, and so that causes this whole ocean circulation. So that's why salinity is really so important to understand, because the changes in salinity really drive the circulation. So actually, the white that we're seeing on this diagram here is actually is ice. So we're seeing ice in these areas. So the really fresh water, because that's ice, and where the salinity has been excluded from.
Great. So a few other questions that we have here. Why, about your coral reef section, why are coral reefs different colors? I think you were talking.
Let's go back to the, oh, wrong direction. Yeah, why are the different corals different colors?
And I know you touched on this, but why is them being white important, I think is part of that question.
Oh, okay. So basically, so the coral reefs have these little organisms, in them that basically help them live. And what happens when they get too warm is they expel these organisms, and that's why they become white. So the white corals here are basically dead because these little microorganisms in them have been expelled out of them. Why the different corals are different colors are, well, that actually I don't know. I mean, I suppose one could ask, why are birds lots of different colors? I'm not a coral reef expert, but yeah, the most important thing here is that when they die, they basically lose their color because they lose these little microorganisms in them. And again, this die-off occurs because the water got too warmer than the corals like it.
Great. Amy asks, can satellites measure the depth of the ocean?
Yes, they can. That's a great question. They can measure the depth of the ocean. That's another application that has been used with satellite data.
And Caleb asks, what are the satellites usually looking at? Like, what are they usually focused on?
I'm not sure.
So I think Caleb's question is asking, are most satellites looking at the ocean? Are most satellites being used for other purposes?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So most satellites are actually not looking at the ocean. So I mean, there's a lot of different satellites out there. There's satellites that are used for communication purposes. There's satellites that actually don't look at the Earth. They look out at the solar system. A lot of our satellites are used, as I mentioned, for weather purposes and for looking at things in the atmosphere. So there's more satellites and sensors that actually look at the atmosphere than look at the ocean. Or of course, there's also ones that look at on land. So oceans are just ocean applications are just part of a large suite of things that of sensors and applications that we put on satellites.
Great. We have a question from Caleb. How many people are on a satellite?
Okay, so oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So basically, the satellites are unmanned, so there is nobody on these satellites. We put sensors on them, and we can put different sensors on it. So some satellites just have one sensor, so it's just measuring one thing. Most of the time, though, we put a bunch of different sensors on a satellite. So we might have 7 or 8 different sensors on there so that it can measure, and each sensor can measure multiple things, but there's no people on satellites.
Thank you.
Just instruments measuring things for us.
Now, Celeste is asking if the satellite data is available on the NOAA website, and I'm going to answer that one. It is. There are various data sets, and what we'll do when we go offline is I will talk with Cara, and we'll put links. If you go to where the webinar pages are on the NOAA Live page, we will put some links to satellite data. So if you want to go and look at some of the data sets and see some of the imagery, we'll put the links right there, and you can click on them and take a look. Does that work for you, Cara?
Yeah, that works great. And actually, in a few weeks, the best way, the server that I'm involved in, where we serve a lot of our satellite data, is something called ERDAP. And actually, not next week, but the week after that, I'm actually going to be giving a webinar on how to use ERDAP. So when we get that scheduled, I can also put that link on there. So if people are interested in kind of how to use that, it's not that complicated, but it's one of those things where if you have a little demonstration showing you how to use it, it makes it a lot easier. So that demo I'll be giving in April. So we can add that link into there as well.
Great. James also asks, how long can a satellite stay in space? And I know you mentioned this, but I think it's of interest and folks may have missed it. So if you could answer that again, how long can a satellite stay in space?
Yeah, so most satellites have what we call a design life of 5 years. So that means that we expect it to last for 5 years. And so with these measurements that we always want to have sustained observations, we plan to put one up continuously. So we want them to overlap so that we know that we can have consistent measurements from them. So it's important for us to have measurements from our next satellite overlapping with our previous one. But some of them last a lot longer. Like we can have satellites that we expected to be up there for 5 years and they last, for 15 years and are giving value and are still giving data. And then there have been some satellites that have gone up and after only a few years, something happened and they, we've had issues with them. So it's sort of like anything else, you can have a car, you can have a new car and, the transmission goes out early, or you can have a car that, gives you, you can drive for 200,000 miles. So it varies.
So I think you've answered this one too, but I think that we've got a lot of questions asking it, so people may have missed it. How many satellites are circling the Earth? So a lot of folks are just asking how many are up there right now?
That's a good question. And there's basically about 2,000 satellites up there right now.
Great. And Elise wants to know, what is your favorite part of your job?
My favorite part of my job. Well, I actually give a lot of talks about satellite data, and I give over 10 years ago or so, I actually developed a little 3-day course to help other people and other scientists, scientists in NOAA and other scientists better understand satellite data and use it in their work, in their science, in their research. And so that's one of the favorite parts of my job, is actually when I do those satellite classes and working with people and showing them how to use satellite data and getting them excited about satellite data.
Great. Ian asks, do the satellites pick up the garbage patch? Can they see that from space?
That is a very good question. And no, there's been a lot of work trying to see if we can get that information, but currently it's not something that we can detect from satellites.
Okay, and Tara asks, do you see any noticeable changes in satellite data in like the salinity you showed, currents, or the amount of algae growth before a hurricane forms? She's wondering if there is any correlation between those and the direction and intensity of the hurricane.
So actually there is the biggest change with the intensity of hurricanes is actually with the temperature. When hurricanes go over areas with warmer water, it actually it sort of fuels them and kind of makes them stronger. So there is work actually that scientists are looking at the temperature of water and the hurricanes and how that affects hurricanes. There is some effects you can see after a hurricane. When hurricanes go through, they stir up the water, and this can have an impact of bringing more nutrients, which are generally deeper in the ocean. And so when it's stirring that up, it's bringing nutrients to the surface. So sometimes you can actually see an increase in chlorophyll over areas that the hurricane has just gone over.
Great. All right. I think at this point we've sort of reached our time limit, and I know that we could keep asking you questions all day, Cara. What you do is fascinating. So I just want to put a big thank you out there to you for sharing with us your really exciting job that you do at NOAA. And I encourage those of you out there that are listening that found this fascinating to think about this as a potential career path. This is something that you could study, and you too could become a satellite oceanographer. I want to also tell you that we are continuing the series while school closures are still in effect. So next Monday, you can tune into our next NOAA Live webinar, which is Onward and Downward, Exploring the Deep Ocean with Catalina Martinez. She works with NOAA's Office of Exploration and Research, and she's in Narragansett, Rhode Island. To sign up for that, you can Google Woods Hole Sea Grant NOAA Live, or where you signed up for this one, we've listed all of our webinars every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 11. But again, huge thanks to Cara for taking the time out of her day. And I know I speak for everyone that it was really, really fascinating to hear you. So thanks for attending, and we will see you all next week.